Oh, we're finally here. Home stretch. Lots of blabbering on my behalf today, so let's just get to it, shall we?
A bunch of degrees of Kevin Bacon down the Kevin Bacon rabbit hole.
Last time we ended with a Werner Herzog film, and why not knock out one more? I'll have Clemens Scheitz guide me towards Heart of Glass.
Erst kommt die Zeit ins Stürzen und dann die Erde. Die Wolken kommen ins Rasen. Dann kocht die Erde, das ist das Zeichen.
Herzog, particularly in his early films, has always had a morbid fascination with nature, and that's on full display in this film from the very beginning. The intro is very mesmerizing and beautiful, even, dare I say, hypnotic. Ha ha! Oh, you may not get this pun yet, but trust me, it's a good one. See, it's funny because Herzog actually had every actor in this film, barring one exception, perform it all under hypnosis. Quite the gimmick, wouldn't you say? This takes place in an 18th century Bavarian town. The town's one major attraction is a glass-blowing factory which produces a special kind of ruby red glass. Some even believe that glass contains some sort of magical power, including the local baron/factory owner. The one man who knows the secret to this glass's production is the master glassblower who passes away, and thus the secret dies with him. This causes a kind of local hysteria. However, there is one particularly mysterious outsider character who wanders into all of this, a man named Hyas, who's a sort of prophet that lives in the mountains. Hyas makes some less than optimistic predictions about the town, causing him to not be particularly popular with the locals. One fascinating fact I learned here is that the one actor who was not hypnotized was Joseph Berbichler, who plays Hyas. I think this is a compelling subversion to expectation. Most would perhaps expect somebody with the disposition of a prophet to be the one with their mind in the clouds or submerged into another realm, but it seems as though Herzog does the opposite by letting the prophet character be the only one who isn't asleep. A prophet making odd predictions, speaking down to a village who is barely able to comprehend anything he says? Wow, if this isn't Herzogian, I don't know what is. This is one of the more moody, atmospheric Herzog films I've seen in a while. It's a juxtaposition of the bizarre and the beautiful, a strong trademark of his. A lot of the performances, though, are a bit strange and wooden, understandably. More than one friend of mine who has seen this before has warned me that they found it pretty boring. I get it, it definitely has a slow pace, and halfway through I was tempted to deem it an interesting but failed experiment. It's definitely not as cohesive as the average Herzog film. However, part of me enjoys the feeling of being adrift and almost hypnotized alongside the cast with the fluid, meditative style which evokes a kind of mental levitation. And yet, I can't shake the feeling that the lack of an emotional anchor could be considered a downfall. This is the kind of film that requires patience, attention, and the proper mindset to enjoy. I'm not sure if I met all of that criteria myself during this viewing, so it's definitely something I believe is worth revisiting at some point. Parts of it did bore me a little bit, but I was actually pretty enthralled for the most part. Even though my mood shifted throughout in relation to the material, there is a single closing thought in the postscript that really made it all gel for me. Masterpiece? Maybe not, but I'll check back probably in a few years, perhaps on the rare occasion that I imbibe a joint. Josef Berbichler is my link now to Michael Haneke's Code Unknown, an apparently less well-known example of hyperlink cinema, a term that refers to a brand of films which gained a decent amount of popularity in the late 90s and early 2000s, where multiple seemingly unrelated storylines converge through a singular event or series of randomly threaded connections, sometimes akin to a rabbit hole. Hey, what do you know? The most mainstream version of this that the average Joe might know is the film Crash. Ugh. But I generally associate this movement with the early works of P.T. Anderson and Alejandro González Iñárritu, sometimes Robert Altman, occasionally Tarantino and Guy Ritchie, but never really Austrian filmmaker Michael Haneke. So let's see what this is all about. It opens with an apparent non sequitur sequence of deaf-mute children playing charades in a special needs school. It's not long after this that we begin to follow the story of Anne Laurent, a French actress working in Paris. As she takes a stroll down the street with her boyfriend's younger brother Jean, he throws a food wrapper at a homeless woman sitting on a corner. This small event is witnessed by Amadou, a young black man who confronts Jean about his rude gesture. This quickly escalates into a bit of a ruckus, and the whole rest of the film is more or less a fractured narrative following the different parties who are involved in this confrontation. Before jumping into all the nitty-gritty, I need to first express how great Juliette Binoche is here. I always thought she was a good actress, but she really knocks this one out of the park, and I think her work, even in this one sequence alone where she's being harassed, showcases her emotional range, even with very little to no dialogue. Style-wise, this film is pretty consistent with a lot of Haneke's directorial trademarks. If you don't know what those are, that's what I'm here for. You have long extended sequences that sometimes drag, but often pay off by building suspense over some subtle interactions. This appears to be in Haneke's commitment to naturalism. There's very minimal score that's non-diegetic, that is, until the final few minutes, though the lines of musical diegesis are blurred in a fascinating way. Also consistent with Haneke's style, a lot of action happens off-screen. Some events are only alluded to. The editing is a bit jarring. A lot of scenes just cut to black abruptly, and often do so a beat or two before you're mentally prepared for. Frankly, I got frustrated more than once as I viewed this because I thought my power went out. Yes, I apparently fell for this trick more than once and actually got up out of my chair in preparation to go reset my breaker when... Oh, god damn it, Michael. Aside from this, there are a handful of other moments that trick and subvert expectations, which I'll abstain elaborating on so I don't spoil their effect. If I have one problem with Haneke, it's that his form and technique are so cold and almost voyeuristic that I often feel at arm's length from the actual plot and characters. But by the end, I was sold on this style of filmmaking for the content at hand, given the raw and stark nature of the story. One thing that stuck out to me, especially in this film, was how brilliant Haneke is at utilizing the space of a single frame where multiple things are happening at once. Take this extended one-shot scene, for example, which I briefly touched on earlier, where most of the action is initially taking place in the background, but then the subject migrates to the foreground and the tense emotional nature of the sequence builds into a powerfully climactic moment. The only true synaptic reference I have for using the same frame this ambidextrously is that of Jacques Tati. Now that I think about it, elements of this film feel a bit like Playtime, though obviously with a much more serious tone. As I previously insinuated, the works of Michael Haneke are definitely ones I often appreciate more than I actually enjoy. There are lots of thrilling components, but they are sometimes interspersed with a lot of mundane moments of neo-neorealism. However, by the end, the technical excellence and the brooding power of the collective themes here are, despite their subtlety, so incredibly stirring as a type of filmic collage that it's unfair not to give the film its proper due. Much like certain works of David Lynch, I think there are elements of this that I find intellectually elusive that may require repeat viewings to understand, but the methods used surmount to an emotional resonance and thematic relevance that are so profound that its value transcends any shallow criticisms yielded to the like-dislike paradigm. In layman's terms, the ends heavily justify the means, whether or not all the means were fully comprehended or found to be personally resonant. Juliette Binoche is going to give us an interesting shift, as she's bouncing us back to Hollywood only for us to go international one last time.
Why can't I feel my body?
Mira, your body was damaged. We couldn't save it. Only your brain survived. We made you a new body, a synthetic shell.
A live-action remake of the 1995 Japanese anime film, this follows the story of Mira Killian, a human cyborg in a dystopian future who is an experimental test subject on the merging of a human brain integration into a cyborg shell rather than AI. Killian is employed as a counter-terrorist operative, but soon experiences some random hallucinations or glitches that give her glimpses into a past that she doesn't remember. As she begins to dig through the past, she uncovers some disturbing secrets related to her inception, and discovers that the enemy AI called Kuza may not be as insidious as first thought, and her decisions with how to deal with this ghost intelligence may jeopardize both her own existence and that of the unit she works for. I already have some huge misgivings about the film before watching it, given the massive controversy it garnered before it was even released. First of all, the original anime film is a sci-fi classic for many reasons, and I'm not entirely opposed to the idea of remaking it, but this film frankly fails on so many levels. First, what I liked. Clint Mansell is involved as composer, and he's composed some of my all-time favorite scores. It's not his most memorable work here, but it's a welcome touch.
All patrolling air units, be advised. Possible cybercrime activity in the vicinity.
I'm also kind of a sucker for cyberpunk, so a lot of the production design I found pretty gorgeous, as well as some of the creative technology and effects. Michael Pitt always plays a decent villain, and in the little screen time he actually has here, he strikes an effective balance of pitiful yet menacing. But alas, that's pretty much where my compliments end. Now it's rant time. Right off the bat, much of the dialogue is crazy bad and on the nose.
You're reducing a complex human to a machine.
I don't think of her as a machine. She's a weapon.
One of the biggest criticisms this film received prior to its release even was the casting of Scarlett Johansson, since it gives the impression that Hollywood is yet again whitewashing and appropriating material from other cultures. Johansson is so horribly miscast. I mean, we get it, she's Black Widow and she can kick ass, but I definitely share the sentiment that having a non-Japanese actress play this role is not only artistically awkward, it's a problem in squelching a chance for appropriate representation. I really do think this concern is more than just some vapid PC complaint. Setting aside the fact that Asian females rarely get their fair share of leads in Hollywood films, I can't help but feel that Rinko Kikuchi would have been the perfect casting choice, or at least any youngish Japanese actress who can execute a believable kick and handle a firearm. Juliette Binoche sadly also sticks out like a sore thumb. Her performance is very stilted too. After being blown away by her performance in the previous film, it just comes to show you that acting talent is often heavily reliant on context and quality of material. It undoubtedly also helps that in Code Unknown she was performing in her native language, but yeah, another bad casting choice. And then there's the material itself. The script is so frustratingly milquetoast. It does seem as though the filmmakers were trying to emulate the structure of the original film, but just with a few tweaks here and there, and then altering the ending. This is just a bad move. Much of what makes the original great is its compelling philosophical and even theological conversations about what makes a human brain human. This core existential gravity is counterbalanced with some moments of intense, shocking violence, demonstrating what the amplified nature of human beings' already destructive tendencies might look like. The remake waters down both the violence, turning a hard R animated film into a PG-13 live-action film, and the compelling underlying themes altogether, which all culminates into a stupid, lackluster ending instead of the haunting one we're left with in the original version. Then there are sequences that just should not have been adapted to live action for lack of believability in this format. I think this film could have been far more effective as an homage, like recreating certain iconic scenes or pieces of the original but functioning mostly as its own story. As it is though, it's both too slavishly living in the shadow of the original film and far from captivating what made it special to begin with. It hence feels like yet another uninspired, trite dud of a remake. Takeshi, or Beat, Kitano is a Japanese actor-director of reasonable clout and yet another blind spot, so here we go. We open on some kids beating up a homeless man. Not long after this, we see Azuma, Kitano, show up to one of the kids' house and beat the shit out of him. I guess we could probably say he's a bit of a violent cop. It may not come as a surprise that Azuma is not just dangerous, he's an asshole. This plays heavily into the morally questionable, dirty Harry cop type anti-hero that he is. The one who's a loose cannon but the best we've got. Shouldn't we empathize with Azuma a little though? I mean, the Yakuza has done some awful things to his friends and family, so can you blame him for cutting loose? I find the subtext built into this to be a little disturbing, but I'll circle back to that. There were some minor pacing and story issues, but Kitano shows still a lot of directorial strengths here, and he's able to pull together a handful of edge-of-your-seat action scenes that build a lot of tension. I can see that he understands the almost music-like tempo that's required to make scenes like these work. So at the very least, in the realm of technicality, Kitano has some strong chops, even with this being his directorial debut. Given the high degree of shocking, gritty violence and the ethically ambiguous protagonist, I began to recognize about halfway through this film that this is the very bread and butter of Quentin Tarantino. I mean, it's probably no coincidence that this and a couple more Kitano films came out in the few years leading up to Reservoir Dogs, as I can already see that Kitano was one of his primary influences for at least the first half of Tarantino's career. I haven't mentioned much about the plot here, but there's really not too much to say other than it's pretty much just a gritty cop drama with some elements of revenge thriller thrown in. What I really want to discuss is this film's approach to and influence on cinematic violence, so let's pivot to that. I am of the mind that violence is a fascinating and important theme, but it's also a dangerous one by nature, since there's sometimes a fine line between being artistically evocative and outright exploitative. I don't generally have a problem with on-screen violence, but when taken to certain extremes without any apparent question marks attached, I start to feel uneasy about it. I'm a little nitpicky when it comes to extreme violence and gore, and I think the conversation between acceptable and indulgent portrayals of violence is a very important one. It usually boils down to whether or not there are any thematic question marks that justify its placement. For example, I generally consider Martin Scorsese the former and Tarantino the latter. Scorsese's violence tends to not hyper-glorify the acts. They are still often shocking and gruesome, but they carry thematic weight and serve the story towards a greater purpose, usually in showing the harm and futility begat by violent behavior. Whereas, I believe Tarantino, though undeniably a great and nuanced storyteller, often actually revels in the blood and guts within his revenge tales, and he's prone to fetishize and occasionally linger on it. Yet, I believe his greatest works show a bit more restraint and selective dynamic as to what purpose violence serves to the narrative. All this to say, as I was watching Violent Cop, much of it initially struck me as being on the indulgent, lesser Tarantino-ish side of the spectrum. Yet the nigh Shakespearean ending does make a pretty strong statement, which I believe counterbalances it a bit into the realm of moral intrigue and gives me a lot to think about. I felt like there was almost no emotional depth until the very end, and then it explodes into a devastating twist, so the ends do justify the means, perhaps. In conclusion, I do recommend this with a couple caveats. Kitano definitely shows strong chops as director here, as I mentioned, and his brooding, silent but deadly on-screen persona already begins to take shape. I can understand how his trademarks have shaped the modern Japanese crime film, starting with this one. So if you have the stomach for the more extreme side of the crime genre, I say check it out. Susumu Terajima is linking me to yet another Kitano film, and I'd like to specify something here. Since this is my final video and I'm nearing the end of my journey, I simply attempted to link Terajima back to Kevin Bacon using this handy little website called The Oracle of Kevin Bacon, where you can insert any actor's name and it will tell you how many degrees they link back to Bacon, or actually any other actor you choose. So Terajima is my first of the final few degrees that let me link back to Bacon Man in an even 30 degrees. The film that came up to connect the dots is Kitano's 2000 film, made in Los Angeles, Brother.
From now on, you're gonna be in charge, just as it always was. You don't have any objection to that, right? Okay, we accept.
Kitano plays a Yakuza gangster who must flee to LA after his clan is mostly annihilated in a crime war. Upon arriving in the City of Angels, Yamamoto must reunite with his estranged half-brother Ken, who it turns out is a member of a Los Angeles gang. Yamamoto's experience comes in handy as Ken's gang must face their own turf war with a rival gang. The theme of gangs of wildly different cultural backgrounds converging is a compelling concept, but what was distracting for me off the bat was how Kitano's style of filmmaking struck an odd tone with the material. Just the aesthetic, you can tell, is different. This isn't flashy or even stylish in the way most American films within this genre are. It looks drab and plain, almost as though it was not color treated at all, and there's just not the usual dynamic flair you expect from films made in Hollywood. This works, I think, for some of Kitano's other work, but it feels a little out of place in this context. Though this story's kind of about being out of place, so maybe it's intentional. Now, as far as themes, let's see. Oh yeah, there is the theme of gangsters showing up, then just fucking shooting everybody in sight. Kitano's primary setting and gimmick is compelling, but it doesn't honestly seem to amount to really saying much. And despite a handful of interesting scenes and some well-directed shootouts, there's not much to chew on narratively. I do think Kitano has a compelling relationship with Omar Epps' character Denny, who's part of Ken's gang. The two function as a kind of odd couple, and I don't know if Kitano was trying to specifically emulate a Rush Hour kind of relationship, but the two characters lacked the on-screen chemistry that's needed to tether emotions down from all the violent madness we witness. I really don't have all that much more to say other than the film just doesn't really work for me. It's largely unpleasant and uninspired. Kitano again seems to like violence to be the prime focus, but this story could have fared better with developing some of the characters beyond the criminal aspects of their personalities. Of the few Kitano films I've seen, none of them have particularly blown me away so far, though I haven't hated them either. And though this one probably has the most compelling ideas driving it, it's the least effective. So at this point, I'm definitely open to seeing more of his work, but I'm not really going to rush out to do so. Full disclosure, since I chose these last few films based on the Oracle of Kevin Bacon, they were pre-planned to follow a path outside of whichever actor I would have personally chosen. And in this case, I believe I should clarify that even though the actress Tuesday Knight was credited as the role of, quote, prostitute in the film Brother, after perusing through the film several times, I couldn't actually find her in the film, even as a background character. My guess is that maybe her scene was cut out, or she just appeared in a quick sequence where she was just not easy to find. But she's credited on IMDb, so she's parking me at my final degree, the 1997 Kevin Bacon film Telling Lies in America.
You sent those postcards in yourself, didn't you? You forged those kids' signatures, didn't you?
No. That's the truth.
Screw it. You got yourself a job, Slick.
Okay, another strange accident in my picks here. I've apparently picked another coming-of-age Kevin Bacon film set in the 1950s, or 60s, I guess. Okay, coming of age, yet again, my favorite. Here we have Karchi Jonas, a 17-year-old high school student who immigrated from Hungary with his father when he was younger, trying to figure out his future. He eventually crosses paths with Billy Magic, a radio personality played by Bacon. Magic recruits Karchi for a job at the station, and Karchi seems to think that this is the kind of career he's bound for. Along the way, though, it becomes clear to us, and to Karchi, that Billy ain't no saint, as he's running some illegal schemes at the station with Karchi as an apprentice. This becomes a scary scenario for Karchi, as it could jeopardize his and his father's path to US citizenship. Brad Renfro does a decent job here as Karchi. It always makes me sad though whenever I see this dude on screen, knowing how young he died of an overdose. Sorry to be a downer, but yeah. It was fun seeing Maximilian Schell as his father, yet another link to an earlier film in my journey here, and honestly, he's the standout character and performance for me. Beyond that, I don't know that there's a whole lot to take away. This is frankly a painfully mediocre film. It's the kind of movie my mom would rent from Blockbuster back in the day and put on in the background while she ironed clothes and then fall asleep to. Nothing about it is remarkably bad, but it's pretty standard even by the rubric of 1990s films of this genre, which isn't a high bar. The latter part of the second act has one little twist that could be surmised from a long way off, and by that point I just had so little investment it was difficult to care. Nothing the film says or does is pronounced enough to make an impact, with I'd say one exception. Near the end, there's a piece of the plot that doesn't gain any significant traction until that point, involving an immigration trial. It could have made the film reasonably effective if that theme was explored to a satisfactory degree prior to that, but it ended up just feeling like a check mark off of a list. Some films definitely remain obscure for a reason. Some gain cult status because they've flown under the radar and never resonated with the right audiences. And others, like this one, had a shot at an audience, but ended up being forgotten under the umbrella of mediocrity. So yeah, this is another film I would not have chosen to watch on my own, and I can't really say I'm glad I did either. But this is just the path the universe had me on, so I'll accept that piece of it. And now, with that, we have come full circle and complete this journey. Thanks again for joining me. I have plenty of new content I'm brewing up, so remember to like, subscribe, and ding that little alert bell so you can stay up to date with all my new content. Until next time, stay sane and stay safe.